Nottingham, the Queen of the Midlands, a city bursting with history, tradition and natural beauty. 60 years ago, like today, the vitality of Nottingham was a complement to her modest prosperity. Local industries such as boots, players and rally were proving that Nottingham was becoming quite the commercial centre. Life was still challenging from the economic restrictions of the Depression, but her citizens still managed to enjoy the recreational activities and simple pleasures the city had to offer. However, this chapter of pre-war life would eventually come to a close, as the threat of Hitler and war with Germany would soon become a reality.
I was 7 when the war started, so it was exciting for a child of that age.
And my mother was very upset. It came through on the wireless that we were now at war with Germany.
We didn't actually hear Chamberlain say that we was now at war with Germany, because we all laughed and says, "Who's the we? Is Mr. Chamberlain coming with us to help us?" Because we'd got no quarrel with the Germans, we didn't know any.
Naturally, we were all on tenterhooks because we didn't know what was going to. He'd gone through all these other countries, and we wondered what was going to happen to us.
War was declared on September the 3rd, 1939, and thousands of young British men were drafted into the armed forces to fight for the freedom of the peoples of Europe and Asia.
All public performances and even cinemas was cancelled for a short while, because of the amount of people that they thought would have been bombed at the time.
So a lot of the young male school teachers, particularly if they were just students, they were called up immediately. The 18-year-olds went up first, and then probably it would be 18 to 20, 20 to 22, etc. So at first, with all the young men gone, we were left with lady teachers, and they weren't sufficient to teach all the children in the school. So they devised a plan at the Harrow Road schools whereby half the children at that school would go in the morning and the remainder in the afternoon.
And one of the teachers, a Miss Cantrell, she had a particular hairstyle where she didn't have a pigtail, it was braided around her head. And all the boys in our class were convinced she was a German spy.
We used to go to someone's house for 1 hour a day, which about being very academic, I think it suited me.
And then eventually, all the old retired school teachers and school mistresses were brought back, and then full-time school began.
They started off by doing this, seeing how long it took us to run home from the school. And if it took more than 7 minutes, then you would stay at school if the air raid siren sounded.
War precautionary measures were meticulously planned and soon mobilised in the city. This film shows the sandbags placed at the council house in August of 1939. Nottingham's elaborate wartime preparation is often attributed to the pioneering work of Chief Constable Athelstan Popkiss. In March 1939, Popkiss became the city's chief ARP officer. It was often thought that his foresight in organising an efficient civil defence plan came from a pre-war visit he made with a boxing troupe to Nazi Germany, where he soon became only too aware of Hitler's future territorial intentions. Under his leadership, Nottingham's ARP was considered to be one of the best networks in the country.
back, it seemed as if the air raid shelter arrived within days, but I'm sure it took a lot longer to deliver them to everyone.
They would have built an Anderson shelter as far away from the house as possible, which was embedded into the ground and covered with earth. That would have been a safety outlet, providing the bomb didn't hit it direct. Others, the terraced houses in the sort of inner city part, they was provided with communal shelters with just like a box. That's all they were. You entered in and there was just basic benches to sit on.
I should think the concrete roof would be probably 6 to 9 inches thick, reinforced, and the shelters were made of double brick with an emergency exit built in. And for the first year or 18 months of the war, we would actually go to bed in the shelter.
It's not very nice to have to get up in the middle of the night, especially in the winter. And you must remember there was not centrally heated houses, there wasn't hot and cold water, and to get up, and it was not very pleasant. And you only did it out of sort of really, if anything was going to happen.
Now the respirator has to be made in different sizes to ensure accurate fitting.
Gas masks were issued to every citizen. People were required to carry their gas masks with them at all times in anticipation of an enemy gas attack.
Gas, mustard gas, Vernon Road. Warhol Street round Vernon Road to take gas precautions.
Places of mustard gas.
Canal Street inside. Mustard gas, Vernon Road. Large area contaminated.
As it happened, such an attack never occurred during the course of the war, but the government were taking no chances.
Why, even a little child could wear one. Mary, will you wear one of these for me?
Oh, yes, please.
Splendid. Let me have your dolly. That's right. Now let me put it on yourself, will you? That's it. Fine. That's grand. All right. Now take it off the proper way, from the back. That's right, not from the front. Come along. There we are. That's fine. Splendid. All right?
May I have one for my dolly?
Oh, yes, of course you shall. Rather.
Blackout conditions in Britain were adopted at the start of the war as a necessary precaution to protect homes and communities from enemy attacks. The reinforcement of blackouts meant a sharp departure from peacetime normality.
Because there were no streetlights, on cloudy nights, the streets were black. You could actually walk into people, because it was so dark.
Well, the blackout was terrible because obviously in winter time we were travelling on trains to Nottingham and it was dark, so we were only allowed one light in the carriage, which was painted blue, which was quite horrible looking really, and everything outside was dark. There were no lights, nothing to guide you, and all the names of the stations and towns of course had been removed because in case they'd got any spies there, and it was all quite dramatic really.
It was exciting when you got the news that they'd got number 8 batteries in. That was what your torch that you carried around with you. You took a number 8 battery, I think, and if Woolworths or Boots or anywhere that had got number 8 batteries, you formed a queue to get them.
Within the house, I always remember we had to put beige coloured mesh all over the windows in every room. Mother had to put blackout curtains, attach them to the other ones so that they were pulled at night time. You had to have a big curtain over the front and the back door so that if you opened it you could camouflage it to some extent. And we had the ARP walking round and they did call out if you'd let a chink of light through.
And you got your blackout, people knocking on your door, no lights, blackouts,
You got
you
the
know,
smoke
no
screens
lights.
up.
Oh, them smoke screens on Meadow Lane was a
Burn
nightmare.
the oil.
Nightmare.
Smoke screens were employed to literally cover the city in a cloud of smoke.
But it created this terrible smell and fog, and
And of course, where I worked in engineering at Lenton, I had to be there for 6 o'clock in the morning, and these beastly things would be still, you know, very pungent.
And these are made of big oil drums with chimneys and a little sort of hat on the top.
The smoke
like a fat drum with a long thing with thingy on top, wasn't it?
And when the wind was blowing over Nottingham from this side, the army would come just as it got dusk, and they would light all these smoke screens, and you'd get this black smoke puthering out, which you hoped would go over there.
Bashing into him, remember what, Joe Webster, he stood and fought one. He was that drunk, he stood and fought one going in navigation pub. I'll hit you, he says, I'll bash you.
Along with the threat of enemy air raids, there was also the threat of enemy infiltration into national security, as described by Inspector William Wigg, communications officer with the Nottingham Police Force during the war.
We'd get a report that a certain doctor was of German origins, and we got some mysterious wires coming down from the bedroom down to in the back garden. And when it came to, it was his youngsters who flying aircraft there, model aircraft down the wires. We had lots of inquiries about different people in there, but we never found anything that warranted being arrested or anything like that.
Air raid warning. ARP personnel should report to their centres without delay.
Civilians needed to be told that they weren't to risk their own lives unless their property was imminent and they could deal with it, and they were having to be taught, both by the air raid wardens who were taught by the fire service, how to deal with the incendiary bombs by using sand and how to use a stirrup pump.
Civilians were encouraged to join various civil defence groups. The Auxiliary Fire Service was established to give support to the existing fire brigade, who, despite having considerable high standards of training and up-to-date equipment, could not be expected to cope with wartime emergency conditions. Approximately 45 auxiliary fire service stations and depots, manned by 1,046 men, were operational within the city limits.
From the police point of view, we had to do our stint of fire watching in case of bombs, and we took it in turns in fire watching, and we used to lie on camp beds at night, wait for in case of any bombs or anything like that, and we used to get 3 and 6pence a night, and I was very light sleeper in those days, and I could never sleep, so I used to spend the 3 and 6pence on 2 pints of beer, and that enabled me to sleep.
First aid posts were also set up. There was one first aid post to approximately every 15,000 people throughout the Nottingham area. The Red Cross joined with the Order of St. John to form the Red Cross and St. John's War Organisation. They established 6 auxiliary hospitals in the county, as well as creating the Central Hospital Supply Service, which involved members knitting and mending comforts for hospital patients and prisoners of war.
And they asked me if I would walk round the streets with the air raid wardens if there was an air raid. And instead of going into the shelter with the rest of them, I walked around the streets with the wardens.
I went down to Eastcroft to sign up for Red Cross course, hoping to become a useful member of the Red Cross. We did a rush first aid and a nursing course to get trained as quickly as possible. And we did 2 nights a week nursing for 6 weeks, and then an exam. And then 2 nights a week first aid, and then another exam. And then we were considered ready to go into hospital. And I went to the city hospital every Friday night until I'd completed my 50 hours.
I found this Royal Marine badly injured. I don't know whether he'd been caught up in an air raid or what happened, but I was coming back from a wedding when the sirens went. And of course I stopped and I said I was with my mum and dad, and I said, definitely something wrong with him. I could tell with his breathing. So I went over and I could see the state he was in. So my underskirt came off and was wrapped around his head. And I thought, now what am I going to do? The sirens have gone. And I saw somebody coming down the street in a car. So I whipped out on the road, I stopped his car, and I said, I want you to take this man to the hospital.
All this wonderful work to reduce human suffering can be done by you, and by you.
But I wanted to do voluntary work as well, so I joined the WVS.
The Women's Voluntary Service recruited volunteers from all women's civil defence services.
We did so many varied things, really, with that. I used to go to the council house, I think it was most Friday afternoons, and pack parcels for the forces. People contributed various things, and of course the firms did. John Player. Most of the firms locally sent things.
The Nottingham Services Comforts Fund was the largest of its kind in the country. It sent comforts to over 125,000 serving men and women. Between 5 and 6 million comfort parcels and other gifts were dispatched.
They had a forces canteen on the Victoria Station in Nottingham. That was good because we had forces, we had the big troop trains come through. We had to mash the tea. We used to take it, well, the porters took it down in buckets, the tea, onto the platform. The canteen was upstairs, you see, and then we served the troops on the train. There'd probably be between 400 and 500 troops on the train, so it had to be done quickly. And it was all, you didn't know, well, we knew that they were coming in, but we weren't allowed to tell anybody that this troop train was coming through. And we served the tea in jam jars, because we'd got nothing else. You couldn't get china, well, you couldn't get cups of any description, really, you couldn't get much at all. So we served them these sandwiches. Fortunately, sliced bread had just come in. It was usually dried egg sandwiches with anything crust or anything we could find to put in, and slabs of cake, fruit cake, which I remember some of them were sort of bright yellow. But anyway, they enjoyed it, and the lads did.
This amateur demonstration film, shot in Colic Park, clearly shows how civilians were trained to remove injured parties from a bomb site. The mock injuries inflicted on these civilians were to demonstrate that injuries can vary in size and severity, and how they should be treated. The graphic depiction of scars and wounds is one that is still used today in training for air disasters. Civilians were also trained to enroll the support of local civil defence forces in the transportation of injured persons to rest centres and shelters. In order to put the civil in civil defence, refreshments were laid on after the exercise for rescuers and rescuees alike. On the 14th of May, 1940, Sir Anthony Eden, then Secretary of State for War, broadcast an appeal for men between the ages of 17 and 65 to form a new force whose primary function would be to guard factories, railways, canals and other vital points. Initially, the new force was called the Local Defence Volunteers and then became known as the Home Guard.
My father, who was a textile designer and a local artist, said this was the nearest he could explain what it felt like when he first learnt to shoot with the Home Guard.
There were 5 Home Guard battalions set up in Nottingham. One was confined to the factory units, and the other 4 had detachments covering 8 districts.
Father would be with the Home Guard around Hillside and Triumph Road. It was all a field then with a hedge. And I can't remember whether it was another platoon, I presume it was, of Home Guard who were the enemy on this particular day. So Father used to get me to cycle round the boulevard on my bicycle, and if I could see that the other Home Guard were gathering at Adams Hill, then we would hang on the back of our hedge a red towel, and he would look over the wall where on the other side of the field where the canal was and say, oh, they're at Adams Hill. But if they were a bit further along, then I would put, say, a blue towel. The Home Guard would be in this trench behind the hedge with bags full of flour, and then they'd come along in their jeep or whatever and lobby. Oh, it was wonderful to watch. I mean, it was very like Dad's Army.
The youth of Nottingham were also eager to participate and provide their services for the war effort. Young people were encouraged to join various youth organisations, such as the Nottingham Boy Scouts, Civil Defence Cadets, Boys Brigade, Girls Training Corps, the Nottingham Girl Guides, and the Army, Marine and Air Cadet Corps.
Air Defence Cadet Corps was initiated by the Air League of the British Empire.
Cyril Ball, along with some business associates, formed the 138th Air Defence Cadet Corps. Squadron Leader Ball, a First World War fighter pilot and the brother of Albert Ball VC, was also an accomplished amateur filmmaker who was responsible for this colour footage.
Well, aeroplane mad, as most lads were about that age, and their great ambition was to become a pilot in the Royal Air Force. That was really it.
Originally, there was no uniforms. We went quite a while without uniforms, and there was that big an influx of cadets or young lads into the cadet force. They had to form a 139 squadron, and I believe the 209 squadron was down at Trent Lane as well. Training twice a week, Saturdays, Sundays. Attendance, anything from 80% onwards. And it shows the amount of interest that young people in those days found in joining the Air Cadets. War was expected, and of course we all wanted to go into the Air Force. We had 2 aeroplanes down there, didn't we?
The Bristol Bulldog and Tiger Moth. But airframe fitting and repairs on this Tiger Moth, they were all carried out under instructors who knew what they were doing. And
anybody who were interested in sport, boxing, physical training, etc., used to go down on Thursdays. It developed from Thursday to Tuesday and Thursday.
Yes.
We used to do a lot of running around the racecourse, faster than some of the horses go actually. And then we used to go back, punch ball. We had a punch ball, a ring, a skipping ropes, punch bag. Had quite a good team.
Friends, they were super lads.
Super.
Yeah.
It was marvellous.
Yeah. There was never any trouble, and everyone, good comradeship. That's what it was all about.
Everyone then was purely a volunteer, wanted to be there.
Well prepared.
I think the beauty of that, it not only prepared us for the forces, but it prepared us for our later life.
In 1941, conscription for women was introduced, whereby the available pool of female labour could be channelled into areas of the war effort where they were most needed. Many women filled traditionally male-dominated occupations, such as postal workers, bakers and bus drivers. Big businesses continued to make strides during the war. Boots' manufacturing capacity was vital to the war effort. Measures were taken to protect the D10 factory at Beeston against damage. Where possible, all glass was removed and replaced with fireboard, and the exterior was painted in camouflage colours. Boots also contributed to the Dig for Victory campaign, aimed at the greater production of food. Some 40 acres of land around the Beeston factories were planted with vegetables. Raleigh demonstrated their complete overhaul of production during the war in their film, Thus We Served.
This huge plant was placed at the nation's disposal as it had been in the last war. The wheels of the war machine began to turn rapidly. From this period, the Raleigh works never closed. Working all day and all night, 7 days a week, vast quantities of war material began to come off the machines. The Raleigh Company was singled out to become the largest fuse manufacturers in the country, turning out no less than 150,000 fuses of various types per week. The basic production was the 119 percussion fuse, comprising 30 separate and distinct parts. Vast quantities of these percussion and time fuses were used by the artillery of the 8th Army in their victorious North African campaign, and later in all other theatres of war. Another great undertaking of the Raleigh factory was the manufacture of 20mm cartridge cases, shells and fuses for the famous Hispano and Oerlikon guns. The Hispano gun was the main armament of the Spitfire and other fighter aircraft. No less than 2.25 million rounds of this ammunition were produced each week at the Raleigh Works, making this factory the largest industrial manufacturer of fuses and 20mm ammunition in the country. The Battle of Britain saw the Hun shot from the sky. Raleigh workers were proud to be some of the many who helped the few. Bicycles for commandos, an urgent necessity. Here is where Raleigh was on top of its form.
A bit hush-hush, I think, because I was just taken off doing one particular job, and next thing I knew, I was tapping the bottom brackets out.
They soon produced a wizard folding machine that could be assembled in 30 seconds. The commandos used these wherever commandos went, and they went to plenty of places.
You wasn't told nothing. As far as I know, there was folded up and put on the paratroopers' back, and so they could use them when they parachuted into France or Holland.
Big corporations like Raleigh had their own home guard, air raid wardens and shelters, fire watchers, hospital and canteen facilities.
The lunch interval was a welcome break in the day's toil, as welcome as the entertainment provided by the Raleigh Works Wonders Band throughout the war years. Even foremen have to eat, though some people don't see why. Blimey, tablecloths.
Local businesses, large and small, encouraged their employees to donate money from their pay packets to the War Savings Campaign. In 3.5 years, Nottingham subscribed more than £18 million to the campaign. Transport in the city became scarce and infrequent during the war. Nottingham City Transport lost 4 buses to the air raid precaution in 1939 and another 6 in 1940. Bus times were very irregular due to the blackouts and rationing. Most buses stopped running by 10 p.m. every night. All headlights were to be masked with white painted mudguards and bumpers, and the lights were a nighttime blue. Buses were parked away from their garages overnight and at weekends to avoid major losses during air raids. One dispersal point was the Forest Recreation Ground, where a system was devised to plug buses into electrical supplies to keep radiators warm in order to ease morning starting. Fuel rationing, beginning in October 1939, meant that many services had to be withdrawn. Barton buses was the first company to introduce a bus that ran on gas. Rationing, of course, also became a part of everyday life from 1940.
You couldn't go out and buy all the food and the sweets, and everything started to get shorter and shorter in supply.
It was always co-op and the butchers and
you couldn't get eggs or fish or anything like that. Not unless somebody got some black market where, you know, you was going to pay a bit extra to go and get a couple of eggs, fresh eggs, like, you know.
To keep a chicken in our cold house without them knowing.
I remember queuing with my mother and not knowing what was being given out at the other end. So the ladies saw a queue of people, they would join it and probably say to the person in front of them, "What are we queuing for?" And she would probably say, "Well, I don't know." But it was obviously something that was in short supply, and this particular shop had a quantity of it.
Oh, we had dried eggs, that's right. Powdered egg. She'd spoon, I think, a couple of spoons into a dish and then mix it with a bit of water and put a drop of milk in, and salt and pepper went in. And then it was in the saucepan, presumably not with any fat, because you couldn't spare fat to put in the bottom. Just stir that out. Tasted pretty cardboardy.
On several occasions, my grandmother would say to me, "Have you brought your rations with you?" Because if we were staying for a sandwich, which of course she would give us, she would wipe on the butter and almost take it off again. That's how it was.
Mother had to make a meal out of anything, and if they could get anything off ration and things like that, they did it, and perhaps a few rabbits and things like that, you know, make a good old stew. Because my grandfather had got an allotment, so he used to grow quite a bit of the food.
Thousands of ordinary citizens also participated willingly in the general effort to produce food, however and wherever they could.
But Father decided that it was more important to keep the back garden for potatoes rather than shelters. We had 2 chicken runs, and later, getting towards the end of the war, my father even kept pigs. So at least we had fresh eggs, which was denied to a lot of people. Although the chickens weren't killed, as it were, they more or less had to die of old age before they arrived in the pot.
And as for people wanting to get married and organising a wedding cake and things like that, it was impossible. You couldn't do that unless you had a lot of family who were prepared to give up their butter and sugar and all the other things that go into a cake in order to produce it for you. And I understand that some of them did that. Because an awful lot of young soldiers, young people, probably the soldier was going to go abroad, had a tendency to want to get married.
My husband hadn't been called up then, but it was in May 1940 that we were married. So I was lucky because quite a few people contributed clothing, you know, points to me, and my sister was very, very good at dressmaking. So she made all the dresses, mine, the bridesmaids, and my mother's dress. She made all those. So that saved us quite a few. And of course, food, I mean, the reception, we only had a little one at home. We lived at Bobber's Mill, it's only a small house, 2 up and 2 down. But the reception, such as it was there.
The radio was very limited. There was only I think it was the home service. No television, of course. Entertainment was very, very home, do-it-yourself things. The cinemas was a Monday, usually Monday to Wednesday, and then Thursday to Saturday, and the Sunday night. So you got 3 changes of programmes and a load of cinemas to pick from, and it was quite a place to go to.
It was an escape route for us all, really. My husband, he was fond of the cinema as well, and he'd write and tell me what films he'd seen, and I'd write and tell him what films I'd seen. It was just one of those things that kept us together, really.
Well, we used to go to the pictures for tuppence, you know. We used to see Carboy first at the Aspie Pictures, that was, and then followed by a serial, Flash Gordon and Ming, and that was a real treat. And I got thrown out once for smoking.
There was a lot round here. The Capitol had opened at the bottom here, and the Grand Cinema. Oh, there was a lot. Boulevard, a lot of cinemas all around here and in the town as well.
And the pubs, of course, they were limited in their hours. Sometimes they would open and they would not have enough beer to go round for the whole session, and they'd just close the place down. Or someone would come in and say that another pub, say half a mile away, had opened up, and the people would just dash off from one pub to another.
Due to the fact that we were a free house, my mother was round about and she played off one brewer against another to obtain sufficient supplies. But her real stroke of genius was the matter of Scotch whisky, which was on sale in the pub permanently throughout the war. This was achieved with the fact that in those days we lived on Woollerton Hall Drive, and in early 1939, when war was obviously inevitable, my mother had an air raid shelter dug in the garden, but when Nottingham's big Blitz raid came, I'm afraid we couldn't get into it because my mother had filled it with whisky.
When you could hear aircraft going over, my mother would sort of look at me and say, it's one of ours, it's one of ours. But I think now that she may have been trying to convince herself more than she was trying to convince me.
Whereas a British plane is boom, a long steady note like that. So when we heard this, we knew they were German aeroplanes. The next thing we would hear is, the moment they came in range, the anti-aircraft, 3.7 anti-aircraft guns on Beechdale Road would open up.
Fire! Fire! Fire!
And by this time we'd given up going in the air raid shelter. We got rather blasé, so I used to get into bed with Mother while Father paraded round in his Home Guard uniform. And we heard this zzzz noise, and my father got hold of the sheet and yanked it and tipped us with all the bedding onto the floor. And I'm afraid that we were hysterical with laughter, and Father said, "You silly bitch, it's a bomb." And we kind of waited for what's going to happen next. And nothing seemed to happen, and then a little voice from the back bedroom where my grandmother slept said, "Oh, Billy, there's a lovely bonfire in the back garden."
One of our regular customers was a pork butcher named Mr. Jordan. I never knew what his Christian name was. And because he was a pork butcher, he was archetypal pork butcher, fat gentleman. And as he stepped out from Long Road across to the bell, down came the Messerschmitt, all the way across. And he leapt back. You see, then he started coming forward again, and it came down the other way, all the way across. Yeah. Well, the poor chap was portly of build, and had quite an age on him. And he kept jumping backwards and forwards to get protection of Pearson's opposite. Eventually, the Messerschmitt cleared off, and Mr. Jordan came in. And my mother, who had been witnessing this out the office window, came downstairs and gave him a double whisky on the house for his determination, despite enemy activity, to get into the bell.
We understand that there was, in the Vale of Belvoir, there were decoy fires lit in the firm hope that the German bombers would think that that was the city of Nottingham that was bombed, and that their aircraft before them had made some successful hits and the city of Nottingham was ablaze. And it is said that that decoy of fires in the Vale of Belvoir saved the city of Nottingham a tremendous amount of damage.
Despite enemy decoys, the Luftwaffe was still able to penetrate Nottingham's formidable civil defence. In 11 attacks on the city, 181 people were killed. Most of the casualties occurred on the night of May the 8th and 9th, 1941. The Nottingham Blitz saw the city experience her worst damage. 159 people were killed and hundreds more injured. A total of 95 enemy aircraft attacked that night.
I recall being at home in my lodgings and the sirens sounding, and I turned out as we were instructed to do.
All we did was just cram together, a mother and 3 children, just huddled together underneath this table. And it was very frightening when these bombers that you could hear whistling down was getting louder and louder, and the sound, as it gets nearer, it's very, very terrifying.
Nobody bothered to get up when the sirens went until we heard the biggest bang. And when we got to the bottom of the stairs on his hands and knees, all the windows was coming in the back. And then the next one went, and all the front windows went in from there, from Free Street.
This tremendous explosion, 4 houses on the railway side of Charlbury Road were completely blown up. The damage opposite, directly opposite, was incredible. I saw it. Front doors were simply taken off the hinges and blown straight up the stairs.
I biked down a street called Handel Street, which led to King Edward Street and so on to the fire station on Shakespeare Street, and that was a mass of glass. But I got into the station yard and the sergeant in charge said, right, sling your bike in the bike shed, Hodson, get on this fire appliance, and we went to Boots, Island Street, Station Street, which was quite a conflagration around there.
A stick of bombs actually fell straight in front of the pub. One landed right outside the front door, in the middle of the road, outside the front door. And immediately a taxi with its way through town plunged down into the first crater. The stick continued down the road and blew out one of the pillars of the old Lloyd's Bank building. Another one demolished the old Moot Hall.
As each one gets louder and louder, you get that feeling, you know, you think, is this going to be my turn? And it was. And as it came, I can distinctly remember the sound, the terrible sound as it came down. It was a real whining shriek, and then everything just, it's absolute hate. You know, everything goes crazy. No colour or anything, just a huge explosion, a bang, and silence, and utter darkness.
My father took me outside to the front of the house and lifted me onto the garden wall and stood with his arm sort of around my waist, as it were, and we could look straight out over the city, and the sky was aflame from sort of horizon to horizon.
The top floors were well alight, and we were endeavouring to put this out, and we got into the top floor, and there was a raking ladder which led up into the roof, into the part where it wasn't on fire, where we could get at that which was. We'd just got to the foot of this set of steps when this senior man said, right, out everybody. He heard creaking. Now, knowing he knew what he was about, we all rushed out of the building, down the outside staircase, leaving the hose as it was, and we'd just got across the yard when the whole of the roof caved in. And so it was a very lucky escape, really. And we were engaged on fires in that area all night. We watched the St John's Church on Canal Street start and finish because there obviously were not enough fire crews to fight these fires.
I think we were buried for about 5 hours, so I would imagine it must have been about 4 hours when we heard scratchings above us and people saying, anyone there? So of course I answered, and then eventually a chink of light appeared, a hand and a voice and a head, and they hauled me out into the big day, into the morning daylight. I think it was about 7:30. There was a lot of cheering and clapping going on.
And it wasn't until later that we learnt that the bombs had been dropped and destroyed the cooperative bakery on Meadow Lane. The reason I remember it so dramatically is that my father worked next door at the Co-op dairy.
The biggest tragedy of the Blitz occurred at the Co-op bakery, Meadow Lane, where 48 employees and a member of the Home Guard were killed, and another 20 were injured.
One of the biggest, apart from the baker, etc., was that air raid shelter at the bottom of Carlton Hill. That got thumped and it's horrendous.
But I did get leave, and I came back. I got off the train at the Midland station and walked down the station street to see my old mates, sort of thing. And we got down there, a heap of rubble there, just where the building was with a hole and some bits of wall around it. So that was a shock to me. So eventually I saw somebody poking about the rooms and asking what had happened. They said, oh yes, there was a big raid on Nottingham, and they told me who died. I said, oh dear. I said, I worked with them.
The next morning we came down fearful. We knew all this was going off in the middle of the night. We came down next morning fearing we'd lost the pub. And fortunately for us, all the blast went across the road and took out all the windows of Yates and Pearson's and everything else. We weren't touched at the front. But we did get some of the old Moot Hall blown through our bathroom ceiling.
In all, some 482 high-explosive bombs and hundreds of incendiary bombs landed on the city, destroying 200 houses and making another 250 unfit for habitation. Six rest centres were in operation, and they dealt with 1,286 people who'd been bombed out.
And of course the following morning he left work, came walking round the corner and was confronted by a policeman. He said to him, where are you going, sir? He gave him his address and he gave him the sad news, that his house had gone, and he couldn't give him any information about his family. And from there he had to sort of go and find out. Eventually he found out that my mother was in hospital, and we'd been sent to this rest centre and cleaned up, and we was okay.
In March 1944, Nottingham experienced an invasion of another kind. This time, it was the American 508th Parachute Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division. Over 2,000 paratroopers set up camp in Woollerton Park to prepare for the secret European invasion, which later became known as the Normandy landings on D-Day. Woollerton Park would later house the Italian and German prisoners of war, but it was the Americans who made the biggest impression during their brief stay.
We did have quite a lot of fun. I mean, we did have the Americans for a start.
Oh, that's another matter.
The Americans were overpaid, oversexed and over here.
That's quite, well, I nearly became an American war bride.
I don't think the menfolk were very pleased because they'd got more money to spend than the average serviceman, and consequently they got the attention of the girls while the men were away fighting.
And I did go cycling, I remember one day, because we wanted to see where it was, and these Americans were standing at the gate and chewing gum. then this American asked me something and I didn't know what it was, so I said, no, thank you very much. And in later years I learnt what he'd asked me, so I was quite quite pleased I'd given the right answer.
An American had got his girlfriend on the grass, and he just about obliterated her body, and the dog went and licked her face, and a look of sheer bliss went over her face. I think she thought it was the American that was doing the licking. She was rather astounded when she found it was a little dog.
He asked me to dance, and all he did was shuffle, and he wanted to, I could feel his hands up and down. I thought, tie up.
We went direct to Woollerton Park. We arrived there in the middle of the night and rode trucks and buses out to Woollerton Park during the blackout. So we had no idea of what the place looked like at that time. The next morning when we woke up, it was daylight, and we fell out, and there were the king's deer in every direction, and and it seemed like World War III broke out about that time, because there was live ammunition showed up, and some of the deer were killed in the onslaught. Of course, none of us knew at that time those deer were property of the British government.
And they dished out quite a lot of goodies at times to people, children, because they were so much better off than we were.
The soldiers would come in army trucks. Maybe they were going to collect or deliver something or other, and occasionally chewing gum would be thrown out of the back of the trucks.
I think that Nottingham was probably the best post that we were ever stationed in. Our housing out there was in Tent City. We had 6 men in a tent with a coke stove in the middle of it. That wasn't the very best of living arrangements, but the city itself made up for that. We went to the theater, of course, several times, and the Palais de Danse was there. We went there in the evening and danced with the local girls. The old Horse and Groom, which is just a block from the council house, I don't think that is anymore, and the old trip to Jerusalem Inn, it was off limits to our crew many times.
And, we were enjoying ourselves. Anyway, at the end, of course, I'd got to be brought home. So these American officers, oh, we'll take you home, we'll take you home. So they did, about 4 of them, I think, 4 or 5, in a jeep. Landed home at about, I think it wasn't terribly late, it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, something like that. Rolled up here in the blackout. I come in and quite enjoyed myself, let myself in, went upstairs. My husband had come home on leave unexpectedly. He was in bed.
And I used to come running up Trowell Road, which was by my place, jogging and singing, on the march. And over the march I was trotting a little bit, groves of them, thousands there. And then all of a sudden they've gone.
Of the 2,000 men who went to Normandy, only 800 came back.
I was standing at the foot of my company commander's grave at the cemetery at Saint Laurent, and somehow or other I got the idea that I should start a reunion, find out how many I could find from the regiment and get them all together again. And they tell me I'm off my rocker, but I still think the idea came from Captain Ruddy, who was my company commander.
After Normandy, our company commander, our first sergeant, battalion commander, and most of my platoon were all gone.
And I think it would be proper to be all hand salute. 2.
that the war ended, the whole edge of the road, people put candles, because we weren't allowed a light, you know, to shine, and everybody lined the streets with a candle.
We all rushed out onto the street, and adults and children alike, and said, the war's finished, the war's ended. And you kind of didn't know what to do, and we all looked for if we got any Union Jacks or flags.
Yeah, they had all the flags out up all the streets. They had the tables and chairs out and the parties with all the kids and the mums and waiting for the dads coming home, you know. And they had a really good day and they really enjoyed it.
Yes, a party in the street and tables, trestle tables and food and dancing, and people next door, they allowed their piano to be shoved out into the street and somebody played it, and oh yes, it was great.
Well, we all got together and we all went to do the marketplace, Sab Square, and they were dancing around doing the okey cokey and all that, right, you know, and went round all the various pubs and dance halls, and we made merry until the early hour of the morning.
Unfortunately, this is the only known film of the VE Day celebrations in Old Market Square. Over 20,000 people crowded into Slab Square that day to celebrate the victory over Europe.
Well, there were hundreds, thousands more like. The whole Market Square was absolutely full. Teeming. Fireworks going all over the place.
Climbing up the lampposts.
Yes.
To get a good view.
Yes. And, you know, fireworks going everywhere.
Lord Mayor Francis Carney had this to say to the assembled masses. This is a precious moment in the life of every person assembled here. Outstanding during the past 6 years is the meritorious work of Nottingham in the war effort. Tens of thousands of its men and women have joined the forces and with honour and loyalty have rendered service and duty to their native land. All honour to these brave ones who have perilled all in the time of their country's need. We pay testimony and give praise to the Home Guard, Civil Defence, Nottingham Police, the Red Cross and St John's, Services Comforts Fund, women's organisations, and all those who held authoritative and administrative positions in the effort of industry for the pursuit of the war. Indeed, every person who's worked loyally and well in any labour for the country's welfare, we warmly commend today. You now reap and can enjoy the fruits of all your precious toil.
After we'd been down there and heard the declaration that the, you know, war was over and that, we actually went to the News Theatre on Parliament Street, the three of us, and actually went to watch the concentration camp films, because they'd just started bringing the concentration films, and that, I think, was not a very pleasant experience.
As a child, you had no concept of the terrible suffering or even the fear.
It was always a challenge to me. Some people would perhaps find it depressing, but it wasn't.
There were a lot of good things happened. I got my opportunity to nurse, which I never would have had.
Wherever you went,
Everybody out one another.
everybody from one thing to another.
The camaraderie and the doing things for other people was acute. I mean, you just banded together in a wonderful unit of looking out for other people and helping other people and calling on the elderly and fetching things for people. I've not known a feeling like that since.
Let's face it, it was only victory over Europe. It wasn't victory over Japan. You'd still got fathers, sons, brothers fighting for that cause as well, you see.
Everybody was in a state of euphoria, really. They were on a high because we'd had 6 years of it. And it's a long time, really. And you think things are going to be wonderful, but things don't work like that. I mean, people were coming back to jobs, and people who had been in positions temporarily, of course, were reduced to back to where they were again.
I did go back to Boots, and I found it rather mundane and not active enough.
Some of the men couldn't settle. I mean, some of the men had been Japanese prisoners of war, and they were in a terrible state, both health and mentally. And they were truculent and awkward to deal with, you know, they couldn't help it. And some of the men that had been badly wounded weren't very clever either.
One of the neighbours just around the corner on James Street had been a Japanese prisoner of war, and he returned home obviously at the very end of the war, and he really was a matchstick man. He would have, had he stood upright, he would have been well over 6 feet tall, but he walked with a terrible stoop, and his clothing flapped like some cartoon character. And he was, my mother used to say to me, if we saw him on the street when I was going to the shops with my mother, mother would say, "Don't look." But childlike, you did. And sorry.
It's okay. It's all right. Okay, so do you want us to stop?
We'll stop for a couple of minutes. Yeah.
No, it was the absolute terror on his face. And yet he'd nothing to be afraid of. He'd come home.
over a century, going to the pictures has been very much a shared experience. But the golden age of majestic picture palaces, not to mention the inimitable charm of the local flea pit, is for the most part just a fading memory as the old buildings disappear or transform beyond recognition. In 1939, Nottingham boasted 52 individual halls in competition. Now, only 2 of the originals, the Odeon and the Savoy, remain in operation. The decline in attendance can be attributed to a number of factors, not least the invention on which you're watching this very programme, the television. The first time the people of Nottingham were treated to the illusion of moving pictures was at Europe's biggest and best known travelling fair, the Goose Fair. Thomas Edison's kinetoscope was a relatively crude affair. Because of the design of the machine, only one person could view the images at a time, and the films, which consisted of very basic images, such as a train coming to a station or factory workers leaving work, would run for just over a minute. Caldwell's Gallery on Long Row, adjacent to the then Goose Fair site, Slab Square, was an empty shop, which was converted into a makeshift picture parlour. Several kinetoscope machines were installed, but being little more than an interesting gimmick for solo viewing, the public soon grew tired. Exhibition of moving images to an audience was made possible by the invention of the projector. The Grand Theatre in Hyson Green was one of Nottingham's leading music halls, and it was to become the first local establishment to exploit the new medium, showing a selection of short films at the bottom of a theatrical bill in July 1896.
Trilby, which was a very famous play at the time and had been performed many times by various companies in different theatres. And the Grand had heard about this cinematograph, and they arranged for this to be exhibited. But of course there was no projection room or anything like this, so a screen had to be hastily erected on stage, which was probably little more than a big sheet of hardboard or something, I would think. And the projector had to be put in one of the side boxes and shown at an oblique angle onto the screen. And when a wave rushed towards the camera, this appeared to break over the edge of the stage, and all those that were sat on the front row just promptly lifted their feet up.
The cinematic performance lasted no more than 12 minutes, but it caused a sensation. It was the Palace Theatre on Market Street, later the Scala, then the Classic, which was the first Nottingham establishment to programme an entire evening of filmed entertainment in August 1896. A total of around 50 short films were screened. The fad soon caught on. The public were hypnotised by this novelty, which seemed to replicate reality. Music halls and theatres such as the Empire, the Hippodrome, the Mechanics Hall and the Albert Hall began to show films as part of an evening's entertainment. Shops began being converted into picture parlours. One such establishment was the Midland Electric Bioscope on Arkwright Street, which opened in 1908. But conditions in the picture parlours were far from idyllic. People were crammed in like sardines and made to sit on long forms, boxes, or simply the floor. The projector was often located within the auditorium, standing on an old orange box, while the projectionist hand-cranked the film through, which often rolled straight onto the floor. There were no restrictions on smoking, and the film itself was nitrate-based, which was highly flammable. But this didn't bother the proprietors, as the paying public would come in droves. Inevitably, there were numerous disasters all over the country.
It was nitrate film. As soon as the film stopped, up it went round the back of him and shut the light off with such a bang. it opened the spool box door because the fire went in the spool box. And the old machine was on fire, spool in the other machine, ready, and that film and the spool box was open, and the fire got round to that. So I got two machines on fire. The door in the operating box was an iron door, and I just got behind that and stood on a ladder, an iron ladder that went down to the next floor. And I stood there and I could hear the roar of the fire inside.
Legislation had to be introduced. The new rules included the necessity to isolate the projection room or box, as it subsequently became known, so that in the event of a fire it could be sealed off, preventing the fire from spreading.
Fortunately, I dropped the shutters between the auditorium and the operating box, and the fire didn't go in there, or the smoke, you see, so the audience knew nothing of it.
In addition, walls and benches had to be lead-lined, while the seats in the auditorium had to be secured to the floor. Fire exits and emergency lighting were also required. The Cinematographic Act of 1909 brought about the end of dangerous and unhealthy film shows. It did, however, pave the way for purpose-built picture houses, designed with a degree of ease and comfort and an emphasis on safety as well as entertainment. Nottingham's first purpose-built cinema was the Victoria Electric on Milton Street, which stood opposite the Victoria Station Clock Tower. It opened in March 1910. And, of course, the art form of cinema began to evolve.
Films started to get longer. People soon got tired of seeing kids playing, waves breaking over beaches and simple little things like that. They wanted stories. They wanted to be entertained. And a lot of the very early films, of course, were comedies. Comedies, of course, appealed to all ages across the board. So not only did they get more inventive, they got longer. And of course, cinemas became more plentiful, proper cinemas, that is. I mean, the Victoria Electric was very soon followed by others.
With the increased popularity of the movies, a number of picture houses were constructed in and around the city. It wasn't long before a more lavish picture house was required for the city centre. In November 1912, Nottingham's first super cinema was opened. Located on the site where Caldwell's Gallery once amazed fairgoers with kinetoscope images, the Long Row Picture House took the Nottingham cinema to new heights. Aside from the 600-seat auditorium, there was also a restaurant in the building. The cinema had doormen in uniform, and the public would dress up to attend, as a night at the pictures was starting to become an occasion. During the silent era, musical accompaniment was an integral part of the show, and the Long Row Picture House had the biggest orchestra in town.
The early, very small cinemas could only afford something like a piano accompaniment, sometimes augmented by a violin, and perhaps some ingenious sound effects, things of that sort. The bigger and more opulent cinemas, as we got further beyond 1910 and that time of life, they could afford small orchestras, which got bigger and bigger.
Picture palaces, as they rapidly became known, quickly emerged in all districts from Netherfield to Beeston, Arnold to Trent Bridge, and some, like the Electra and the Imperial, were quite substantial. In those days, metal tokens were used for entry instead of tickets. Many establishments couldn't afford a full orchestra, so often a trio would suffice, or even a solo pianist. Sometimes the musicians wouldn't have seen the film before accompanying it, so imaginative improvisation was often necessary. November 1917, the Somme. It was here that Officer Charles Lomax from Bulwell met London architect Lieutenant Jasper Adamson. The two got talking in an effort to divert their minds from the immediate horrors of war and discover their common interest in cinema. Lomax described an ill-used site on Upper Parliament Street which might be ideal for a super cinema. In 1919, with the war over, Jasper Adamson travelled to Nottingham to visit Lomax and the site. He quickly acquired the ground and planned what was to become the Elite.
The construction of the Elite was a massive undertaking, which was often hampered by the caves running underneath the site. Eventually, the caves had to be filled with concrete in order to secure the surface.
Despite the fact that it was a marvellous building, luxury all the way around, the architects, so rumour has it, had actually forgot the projection room in the design when it was virtually finished. Of course, there was frantic manoeuvring around, what are we going to do now? The most important room in the cinema. So what did they do? They had to build it above the kitchen. So we then had to suffer all the smells, particularly in summer, coming from the kitchen.
Despite the mishaps, the completed edifice was a great success. The building boasted an ornate white exterior adorned with statues. The huge frontage concealed lounges, restaurants, a Georgian tea room, the Louis XVI French cafe, a ballroom and a 1,500-seat auditorium. The Elite enjoyed a civic launch on August the 22nd, 1921, opening with the movie Pollyanna, which starred America's sweetheart Mary Pickford. Huge queues snaked around the block all day in an effort to obtain tickets, with many turned away as the last house sold out.
The first organ was in the Elite cinema, and that was when the cinema opened in 1921. It wasn't a theatre organ as such as we know them, it wasn't a unit organ. It was very much a straight church-type instrument, probably a concert organ, built by the very well-known firm of Henry Willis in partnership with Lewis.
And this is typical with all the different effects and tonal colours. This one has 5 different sets of pipework. I'll just show you. This is the tibia. A string, which is a silitional. A flute. The vox humana, which is a reed. And a tuba horn. Now you can use these in various combinations, and of course you can use them in conjunction with the tonal percussions. And of course you've got some silent picture effects, drum crash, drum tap, fire gong, birds, I think they want a drink, surf, that's the tide coming in, and the steamboat, and a horn. So you can do all the imitations you want to a silent picture.
By the late 20s, the cinema industry had fallen into recession, and many expensive films struggled to turn profits. Something was needed to grab the public's eye, and it came in the shape of the first Oscar winner, Wings. The film starred It Girl Clara Bow amidst an array of sound effects-laden aerial dogfights. The film not only won an Oscar for sound engineering, but also brought in capacity houses and paved the way for the talking picture. It was Warner Brothers who first commercialised Hollywood's latest gimmick with the Al Jolson starrer, The Jazz Singer, which featured his catchphrase, "You ain't heard nothing yet." But it was Jolson's next film, The Singing Fool, which would really set Nottingham audiences alight.
The Singing Fool had arrived in Nottingham, and this opened at the Hippodrome in July 1929, and they played it for 3 weeks to packed houses. Crowds actually packed Theatre Square.
Climb up on my knee, funny boy. Though you're only 3, funny boy.
The first showing was actually at the Apollo, but it wasn't a proper paid showing. What happened, it arrived at the Gaumont, which was the Hippodrome. It arrived there late and the cinema was locked up. So, undeterred, the driver drove round to the Apollo at Berridge Road and knocked up the chief projectionist, asked if he would mind taking in the film. He took the film in,
and then suddenly realised what he got in his hands, the very first talkie picture. And they'd already been fitted up with the gramophone players. The discs were there, the film was there. So the neighbourhood was knocked up and told that they were going to show the Al Jolson film at midnight. It'd be free. And the cinema was full.
Initially considered a gimmick, the talking picture soon established itself, and exhibitors found that the public preferred talkies to silence, even if the sound was somewhat crude. These early sound films carried their soundtrack on 16-inch discs, while the oil-weighted pickups tracked from the centre outwards and were prone to disasters.
I mean, a good example was the Vernon, on Vernon Road at Baseford. Across the road is, of course, the railway line, and tram cars ran up and down Vernon Road those days as well. So if a tram and a train passed at the same time, the combined vibration set up from these would go into the Vernon building, and the needle tracking in the record would jump and dither about on the surface, and the whole thing would go totally out of sync.
Most of the orchestras then were disbanded. The organists were kept on because in the early days the supporting film, or films, the supporting programme, was usually silent, and so they needed an organist to accompany those. And also the sound in the early days wasn't very reliable, and it very often broke down, so you needed the organist to sort of fill in, and sometimes drown the voices, because the early voices were pretty dreadful.
The public were eager to hear what kind of voices the movie stars had. Some silent actors had no problem adapting to talkies, but those who experienced problems remembering lines, not to mention those with thick accents, stutters or lisps, quickly faded away. The first local cinema purpose-built for talkies was the Tudor in West Bridgford. Its Elizabethan exterior contrasted greatly with its continental interior style. The elaborate design was to mark the beginning of a whole new era in cinema architecture, that of the 30s super cinema.
The heyday of the movie theatre in the States was the 1920s, there's no doubt about that. Our heyday was the 1930s, we were much later. But we copied them, and a thing called atmosphere was very, very strong in the States in the 1920s. The idea was that you would go into the cinema and you would be immediately taken into another world. And you did it by having little buildings and trees and twinkling stars in the sky and clouds moving across the sky from the projection box in the interval. That caught on here to some extent in the late 20s. There's only one that had that atmosphere in Nottingham that I can think of, and that's the Picture House at Apsley, which later became the Commodore. It had a suggestion of atmosphere by low relief decoration, trees and flowers and whatever on the side walls. And then early 30s, of course, Odeons started to arrive, 1933, 1934. Their influence came from Germany, striking modern exteriors outlined in neon, which would show up at night. Everybody else copied Odeon eventually. And the idea was that you should have a simple, straightforward interior with straight lines, everything leading to the screen, a fairly simple stage with perhaps 2 sets of tabs, curtains, and no frills at all.
New super cinemas began to spring up all over Nottingham with striking designs and an emphasis on luxury. At its peak, Nottingham could boast 52 cinemas.
The two principal architects in Nottingham, A.W. Thraves and Reginald Cooper, were obviously influenced by Odeon. They worked together in the same practice to begin with, and apparently Cooper was expecting, I think he was really the kind of shining star of the practice. He was expecting to be made a partner. This didn't happen, so in 1934 he broke away from Thraves, and after that they were very much in competition. And they each designed something of 12 cinemas upwards. They were doing about 2 or 3 a year. Many of Cooper's cinemas in the Nottingham area were of this modern design with a tiled fascia, a fin or a little tower to indicate where the cinema was with the name on it, striking exteriors, and Thraves followed that to some extent.
they'd sit there with the curtains a bit closed, with the nice lights on around the proscenium arch.
The actual starting of the show, I mean, nice dimmed out lights, curtains with coloured lighting on, the curtains open and there's your picture comes on. It's presentation to it. And to keep that film there all the time without having any mistakes or anything was like a profession.
It was like being in the army, discipline. Because we all wore, three page boys wore uniform, 2 doormen wore uniform, exactly the same as we did, or like they did. And at 1:45 every day, all the 10 usherettes, chocolate girl, 3 page boys had to stand in line and be inspected by the chief usherette or the manager.
Some of the older suburban picture houses paled in comparison to the new super cinemas and became affectionately known by the locals as the Flea Pit, the Bug Hutch or the Blood Tub. The Sneinton Palace became the Itch and Scratch, the legend being you went in with a flea and came out with a jumper.
But one of the places I used to love to go to more than anywhere was the Boulevard at Hyson Green, and that was a 100% genuine bug hole, and it was regarded with great affection by the locals as the bug hole. But the thing I remember more than anything was they had a lovely huge cat, and it was there to catch the rodents that abounded in the Boulevard, and the cat sometimes used to walk around and sort of rub against your leg like cats do, and you'd go and give it a little stroke and it'd wander off to another patron. A lovely thing. And one day I was watching the film and the cat decided it would sleep on my foot. And the film came to an end, the lights went on, and I looked down, it was a rat. The rat had crept along and decided this looks a nice place to sleep, and it was curled up. And I nearly had a dicky fit.
The crowning event of the 30s was the arrival of the Ritz on Angel Row. A factory, old houses and shops were demolished in order to allow the building of the new cinema. The narrow frontage was humble compared with some of its contemporaries, but the huge 2,500-seat auditorium was most impressive. It was opened by the Lord Mayor on December the 4th, 1933. The 22-rank Konica organ, designed and played on the opening night by Reginald Faw, became an attraction in its own right. Although cinemas such as the Long Row Picture House, the Old and New Empress and the Regent Hall housed Churchill concert organs, only 3 local establishments had specially installed unit cinema organs. The Ritz was one, the other 2 being the Elite and the Hippodrome. The Elite's original Willis concert organ was replaced in 1930 by a Compton organ, which was opened by Herbert Dowson. The Hippodrome's Wurlitzer was opened in 1927 by Leslie James. None of Nottingham's cinema organs have survived, but in the 30s the live show was very much a part of the evening's entertainment. At the Ritz, it was the resident who arrived within 3 weeks of the cinema's opening who was to become a household name.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jack Hellier.
Jack Hellier, who was resident virtually until 1950. And of course, as we know, Jack Hellier became extremely popular. He was a regular broadcaster. The BBC had a landline to the Ritz.
Quality music, and this is what the public liked.
My father enjoyed music. The fact that he was able to produce this as an entertainment, I think, gave him a lot of pleasure. His own particular preferences were classical, and I think he would have liked to have just had Brahms, Beethoven and Bach, given his own choice. But certainly it gave everybody an insight into music that they may not have gone to, say, the Albert Hall in those days or a symphony concert elsewhere to hear, but they had that opportunity to hear it at the cinema, as well as enjoying themselves, coming to the films twice a week. It was an event that happened for people in those days.
outbreak of war in 1939 stopped all cinema building, and partially developed projects, such as the embassy in Beeston, were abandoned. As blackout conditions were enforced throughout the country, the government called for all centres of entertainment to close. Large auditoriums were considered potential death traps in the face of the expected blitzkrieg. As it happened, fears of immediate attacks from the sky proved unfounded, and local cinema owners called upon the authorities to allow cinemas to reopen. But because of the blackout, the lavish neon exteriors had to remain extinguished.
The Rio was the last cinema to actually open when war was declared in 1939. They'd just finished the Carlton, which is now the ABC, and the Rio was the next on the list. They actually opened in the blackout, which was a bit of a shame really, because particularly in the Carlton's case, they planned to have a big opening like the Ritz did. They wanted all the fanfare, searchlights, visiting VIPs, this kind of thing. But war was declared and down come the hatchet on everything. In fact, the building, the Carlton building, was never completely finished because the area above the ground floor foyer was going to be a restaurant, but it never got completed.
With only the radio at home for entertainment, the populace flocked to the local cinema in record numbers, eager for company and amusement.
When the sirens went at the Cavendish, we used to keep the audience in the cinema until the all clear went. We also had 2 feature films stored in a little storeroom we had, right? And then after the main show had finished, we used to get the films out from the storeroom and give them an extra treat. We showed them another feature film or something like that.
People would get up and entertain. And I've heard a lot of stories from people who were in management those days about locals getting up on the stage and doing turns or whatever.
So I got the sax in the projection room and left it there in case it was needed. The sirens had gone and we could hear things going around. And so he said, right, Ted, it's time for the show. You know, get your sax. And he'd go down, I'd go on the stage and Phil would dress up as a vicar. He had all his props around him, you know. And he'd go onto the stage and he'd do his sketch and I'd play a couple of popular numbers and get them all singing to the popular tunes of the day.
And it was basically because people felt that they was contributing something. It helped to boost the morale and keep things going, because the blackout really was a grim time.
The cinema not only provided an escape from the harsh reality of war, it also became a practical arena for many recruitment drives. Despite the all-time record attendances during the war, Nottingham managed to lose 5 cinemas. The Plaza, the Kinema, the Regent's Hall, the Goldsmith Street Picture House, and the Palace, Sneinton. None of the closures were due to enemy action. Since 1936, the exhibition of material aimed at children had been steadily growing. The weekly Saturday Kids Show had become firmly established by 1947.
And whole armies of kids would turn up on Saturdays and fight to get in, fight over where they wanted to sit, fight to get out again.
But there used to be about 300 children in the morning, and the cleaners we used to pay the cleaners to actually control them as near as you could, and they used to have dustbin lids and bang them together to try and get them to shut up before the show started.
Well, I had some experiences at the Palladium. We used to have a Saturday matinee, kids matinee. We're talking about 1938, 39 or maybe earlier. These films were silent films for the kids on a Saturday afternoon. And they were in an atrocious condition. You didn't even know what reel numbers you were using. You had one with a title on it, you had one with an end on it, and then you'd have 2 or 3 in between with real numbers on, but sometimes you'd have a couple of reels with no numbers on. The cowboy films that we showed, there would be somebody killed in the film, and then the next reel, he'd be riding the horses, see, because the reels were the wrong way round. kids were screaming the laughter, you know, and they were really enjoying this. And sometimes I felt, well, the best films we can show is films that come in with reels with no numbers.
I started the first children's club, which we called Miners at Matinees, and I used to get 1,000, and I was Uncle Bert to them. But before I went on the stage, I used to be in the foyer and treat them, not look down and talk to them, and they used to bring to me all the troubles that was on this and that. I used to listen to them, sympathise them. And I mean, I used to go to my office just before I went on stage. My pockets were full of sweets. They always brought me sweets, treacle toffee, all sorts of things like that. Goose gobs, humbugs, all sorts of things.
Well, they used to start off with a sing-song that puts a film on with words on the bottom, you know, all popular for the children.
Then I used to go on stage, and we used to have a sing-song, the Miners song. And then I used to run fancy dress competitions, have them on the stage, things like that. Anything to gain the interest of the children.
And then they'd start off with a film, there'd be a film about 60 minutes of cowboy, western, Roy Rogers perhaps, or Gene Orr singing cowboy, you know.
To have some background music, we used to have records. We used to put records on, accompanying the film. You get one of these films of the heroines die, all very sad, and there'd be a Tommy Dorsey record belting out full swing. And likewise, if there was Indians running all over the screen and so, we'd be playing some violin solo or something like this. I mean, it's totally chaotic.
And then they'd have a few cartoons, perhaps a couple of cartoons, Tom and Jerry, Mickey Mouse and Goofy, all those sort of things, and finish up with a serial.
It didn't matter if you felt ill or weak. You might be too ill to go to school, even on a Friday, too badly to go to school, but come Saturday, back came all your fortitude and strength, and nothing would stop you going to the local picture house to see, you know, the serial, you know. I mean, this week, Chapter 9, you know, the crushing walls, you know, I mean, no self-respecting kid would go and miss that.
Nobody, none of the major circuits would book this film. It was called The Lone Ranger in the City of Gold, and a chap called Rains, Bernard Rains. He was a manager with a lot of flair, and he booked the film, but he also booked the Lone Ranger in person, who was over in London doing personal appearances. And well, St Answell Road at that time was just a sea of children.
It would end at some really exciting moment, and as soon as the words continued next week blazed across the screen, there would be this terrific stampede for the exits. All the doors would fly open and kids would swarm out all over the road and block traffic.
Like the flood out sort of thing till the following week.
The Children's Film Foundation was started by J. Arthur Rank in 1944 and would continue for another 30 years.
The idea was that they were your customers of the future. So if you could get them to come along on Saturday mornings, and as they grow up they'd come along in the evenings.
And a lot of these people will now remember me to this day, you know, because a lot of these children are now adults and got families. But I used to enjoy that part of the job, because I've been a kid myself.
The decline of the cinema was helped along by the advent of television. The coronation of June 1953 boosted TV sales, and it was rapidly becoming a standard feature in the home. Locally, cinema attendances fell by 8 million from the all-time high of 1940.
But they were falling because lack of attendance, because the television was attracting more people now, and the cinemas were suffering badly for it. And don't forget, there was an awful lot of cinemas in Nottingham, an awful lot. And to expect those to remain filled or even half filled when they got the attraction of television coming along was too much to expect.
I think it was the novelty, and people thought, well, why bother, why walk down the road, it's raining, it's going to cost us, and they stopped at home.
Well, of course, television did a lot of harm. And I think the cinemas themselves armed it, because the standard of films fell. a lot of B-type movies and that sort of thing. Of course, people didn't want that. They were seeing better stuff on the television.
The Hollywood studios had to come up with some inventive ideas in order to lure back custom.
When the 3D came in 53, people remember Lying in Your Lap, Born a Devil, all that rubbish.
A lot of the producers stuck 3D in as a gimmick instead of making a good film to start with. Had they made like André de Toth did with House of Wax, if the film was good on its own, it would stand on its own. 3D just made it better. But rubbish is rubbish. And it's no good sticking 3D into it and expecting it to take money, because the public will soon see through that and say, well, the 3D is good, but the film's tripe. And so it would sink. And in no time at all, of course, the spotlight shifted from 3D to CinemaScope, which was Fox's answer to declining audiences. But of course, a lot of the cinemas that were built in the 30s didn't have the provision for wider screens without knocking the proscenium down and rebuilding. And if they didn't want to go to that expense, then they had to resort to bringing the top of the picture down and compressing the image into a little letterbox slot, which looked horrible.
While the CinemaScope format is still with us, other gimmicks were less successful.
When I did arrive at the Scala, the first gimmick, if you like, that we put through there was Flying Skeleton, which we called Emergo. And the idea behind that was that as a body is lifted out of a vat on screen, the skeleton that's dangling up on the wires float out above the audience's heads. And like all ideas in theory, it sounds good. The first few nights it went through, I don't think people really understood much about it. They just sort of sat there and watched this eerie thing glide up the cinemas.
The skeleton that floated above the audience's head, that was great fun, because it would just come trundling past you on its ropes and pulleys, jerking along, and of course it would pass you and come right up to the front of the balcony.
But then, of course, the word went around, and come the weekend, all the boys were in there armed to the teeth with everything, all sorts of missiles you could think of. And this thing would get about 2/3 of the way up the cinema, and someone would shout, "Now!"
And poor old Emergo was pelted with ice cream cartons, drink cans, everything, every appearance. It was great fun.
It was intended to be scary. We ended up with the best comedy in town, you know. I mean, and for 2 weeks we had to sit there with this thing, you know, 4 times a day for 2 weeks. But we got our own back on the people of Nottingham for doing that, for taking it out on our skeleton, because a few weeks later we ran a film called The Tingler, and that involved wiring the seats up to give people electric shocks. Come the first electrocution on screen, you know, throw the switch, you see. And if you look closely, all peering out the windows like this, you know, at the audience, you'd see them all jump like that, you know. And you think, look at that over there.
The burden of the entertainment tax brought about the closure of several local houses, among them the Boulevard, the Curzon, the Imperial and the News House. The tax had been lifted from theatres and concert halls, and by the early 50s, cinemas were the only places of entertainment which continued to be levied.
At that time, entertainment tax was still levied on cinema admissions, but the cinemas discovered that if 1/3 of the programme was live, and they advertised the fact, they got away without paying any entertainment tax until 1960, when it suddenly came off.
In 1955, the Victorian game of Lotto reappeared disguised as bingo, and cinemas were considered ideal venues for the new craze, further driving a nail into the coffin of film exhibition. The Boulevard was the first to convert. Initially, by law, cash prizes were not permitted, but this changed with the Betting and Gaming Act of 1959, which became the linchpin to a dozen more cinema to bingo hall conversions in the 60s.
There will now be a short intermission. From The Girl with the Tray. For your further pleasure, confectionery and cigarettes are available at the kiosk.
The sweets, etc., were cheap.
Fresh strawberries, crushed and taken to the heart of...
So you could get an ice cream for 3pence or 6pence, and the drink similar. You can get a lolly on a stick for a penny or 2pence.
Of the city's remaining cinemas, a number had to move over to the kind of entertainment that the television couldn't offer. Both the New Victoria, later the Moulin Rouge, and the Scala became homes for the continental film. Along with these acclaimed European productions came the occasional risque offering. In November 1964, Cinerama came to the Forest for 3 months. The process required 3 35mm projectors which united the pictures on a giant curved screen. The Forest will play host to Cinerama for 2 more 3-month seasons in the following years before the elaborate process was abandoned. The Nottingham Film Theatre, Broad Street, first opened its doors to the public in 1966, having hitherto been a private film and photographic club. Today it functions as the Broadway, a highly respected multimedia centre which hosts Nottingham's annual crime and mystery festival, Shots in the Dark. For the bigger cinemas, it was evident that drastic new measures had to be taken to attract numbers.
In 1964, I heard the Beatles were coming live to the Odeon. It was just, every aisle was covered with policemen. I mean, I've never seen so many policemen in all my life. Just from one end of the cinema to the other end, downstairs this was. So they couldn't rush the stage. And the screaming was just absolutely horrendous. And I thought, well, what better way to meet them than to go and work there. I got myself a job as 3rd cashier just before it closed.
The Nottingham Odeon daringly became the pioneer of the future of cinema as we know it.
The year is 1965 and the place is Nottingham. Here in Angel Row, the ancient city adds yet another new building to its ever-changing skyline. For here, the Odeon Twin Theatres are opened, an entertainment centre consisting of 2 cinemas, not 1, and a variety of services for leisure. The Odeon Twins are unique, the latest and most advanced example of cinema design in Britain. Almost everything about it is automated, but it will never lose the personal touch symbolised in the figure of its manager, ever ready to meet the people he serves. At once, we see this is not only 1 cinema, or even 2 cinemas. It's a meeting place, a rendezvous, with an elaborate restaurant and private catering facilities, where the people of Nottingham can get exactly the sort of meal they feel in the mood for, at exactly the time they want it. A full meal, a grill, a snack. The range is wide and the chefs are expert. There is even a licensed bar, a great rarity in a cinema in this country. And in the Corolla restaurant, of course, everything is done to see that people enjoy themselves. Meanwhile, the kiosk in the foyer makes a handy shopping place. But of course, the twin-deck cinemas will always be the Odeon's star attraction. The building cost a full £250,000, and the equipment is the most advanced in the world. The projection box is the bridge or nerve center whose electronic brain controls scores of different operations throughout the whole building. Most of them come together in the immensely complicated circuits of the control console, an instrument that can be instructed to do seemingly anything in a theater. Orders are issued to it, its program is set, and it carries out 100 instructions automatically. Aided by a radio link-up, an engineer can study the sound level of the film and its focus and feedback instructions. He can check the temperature in various parts of the building and again instruct the Cinemation control console in the projection room. Cinemation? It's the last word in electronic theatre control. It seems to do everything. Banks of transistor circuits look after the separate tracks of a stereophonic sound film, enabling the sound to come from different parts of the auditorium. A separate panel reports automatically from the other box projecting for the other theatre. But of course, despite the electronic marvels, the film's the thing, and the projectors themselves are vital. Without their smooth running, the show just can't go on. They will be in operation hour after hour, day after day, year after year. So the film is ready. The curtains whisper back. In the box, the arc is struck, the screen widens out. And so for Britain, with Nottingham leading the way, begins a new era in the story of the cinema.
This was the world's first fully automated cinema, built in 1965, and this auditorium is as it was in 1965, opening with the film Sound of Music, which showed for 2.5 years. Also, number 2 downstairs, that was the 1400-seater.
Most of Nottingham cinemas were already out of business. Between 1954 and 1964, 30 cinemas closed their doors for the last time. Because of their unusual shape, sloping floors, the vast amounts of disused space, not to mention the cost of maintenance and upkeep, many cinemas were worth more as flat land than as grandiose, unusable buildings. Nottingham's first purpose-built cinema, the Victoria Electric, ended its days as the Moulin Rouge, showing adult films. It was demolished in the early 70s as part of the new development of the entire block.
January the 1st, 1971, and I was absolutely devastated. They put in a call and said we're closing it, and they closed it at the end of January. Most of the staff had been there years. They were absolutely, they couldn't believe it. Everyone was just completely silent. They just didn't know what to say. And within a couple of weeks or so, they bulldozed the whole side. The support we got from the local people was unbelievable. There wasn't anything we could do.
One by one, they disappeared. Had they have gone twin or triple, maybe they still would be open today. It's difficult to say.
Some of the buildings did manage to become useful in their original shape. Others had the balcony extended, the ground floor flattened, and were transformed into large 2- or 3-storey buildings. The inevitable triple complex arrived in the 70s. 3 cinemas in one, with the former balcony area now becoming the main theatre and the ground floors providing twin cines of varying capacities. The carving up of original auditoriums would not stop there, but the public perception of a night at the cinema has changed over the years. In 1989, England's first National Amusements Showcase cinema opened on Lenton Boulevard to mixed reaction. The multiplex was an idea which emanated from the USA, and with 11 screens on one level, rocking chair seats and massive foyer, the showcase was the ultimate in the new cinema experience. 2 more screens were later added, totalling 13 and catering for 3,200 people.
You go into the cinema and sit down now, and all you see is a big blank white screen. They show you a few slides of adverts, they start the film, when that's finished you've had it. There's no showmanship to it now. I saw the manager and he took me into the operating box, and there was about 10 machines all running showing pictures. There was nobody about.
It was inevitable. It happened in the States. It was bound to come over here.
In the modern multi-cinemas, you just go in there, there's a room, you sit down, there's a screen there, and that's as far as you go until you've seen the film.
The idea of the multiplex is good. People have got 12 choices basically at that one venue. They just go there, they walk in, they've got the choice of 12 auditoriums. There's got to be something out of that lot that appeals to them.
The whole attitude of the city centre cinemas changed then. The audience changed, the profile changed. It was now mainly students and families and those people who couldn't get to Showcase. And we were a little worried at the time that we weren't going to survive. But as it's turned out, with the promotion that Showcase have put in, there's more people going to the cinema, and we've taken the benefit from it.
It was expected that the home video boom of the early 80s and the introduction of the multiplex would starve Nottingham's remaining cinemas of custom. Contrarily, the nearby Savoy fought back by upgrading and adding a 4th screen, and has since prospered. The Odeon introduced more in-house amenities and now has 6 screens. The Broadway opened its media centre, twin cinema and online facilities, whilst the Byron in Hucknall still has 1 screen, but reserves downstairs for bingo.
So every little bit of space that we have has been turned into a cinema to cope with the modern day developments. I think it's part of a night out. Traditionally, if you go back to when I first started in this business, you would have 2 films, so you'd have a look at life, and it was the night out. It took your whole night. Now people can go and enjoy a meal, they can go to a club or a pub afterwards and spend 2 hours at the cinema. And it's a sense of occasion. Films are much better now. I mean, with digital stereo, you know, the presentation on the screen is absolutely superb, and people expect that, and they should get it.
Two of Nottingham's ex-cinemas are still in remarkable condition and have been listed as interesting buildings. The Capitol in Radford, which ceased operating as a cinema in 1968, is still used as a bingo hall.
Sitting here, I think, you know, it's I can't believe it's what, it must be 25 years since I was here. But it is sad because it's a beautiful place, been well preserved. Lovely, yeah.
The Elite is once more commanding the news. It was proposed for demolition in 1972, but these plans never materialised, and the building continued operating as a cinema until 1977, before converting to bingo. The building is currently undergoing extensive work for reopening as a Big Beat nightclub split over 2 levels, but because of its listed status, the work is not damaging what remains of the original interior. Therefore, sometime in the future, it would be possible to restore the Elite to an authentic 20s cinema. The house that ABC built 60 years ago became the latest casualty on a closure list already overlong. As the Carlton, it was once one of the city's leading lights and played host to several film stars arriving to crowds who on occasion blocked Chapel Bar. As the 20th century drew to a close and exciting bold developments were unveiled for the millennium, work was already underway on the Warner Village complex on Foreman Street, with 16 luxury screens, bars, cafes and restaurants. From its humble beginnings, exhibition of moving pictures has evolved and will continue to do so into the future. However, one thing is certain, Nottingham's ongoing love affair with the cinema is unlikely to subside.